I didn't want to interrupt you.
Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me tonight is my guest Connor Exum, who some of you on Twitter might know better as at Trotsky Baby, and who those of you who follow him on Substack will know better as Leon Trotsky, the author of Leon Trotsky's Revolutionary Newsletter. Tell us a bit about yourself, Connor, please.
Well, I'm a disgruntled philosopher. No, I actually have a degree in philosophy. And basically you have two choices with that degree. You either become a teacher and wait for someone to die so you can get finally a professorship, or you start writing. So I decided to start writing.
Makes sense.
And hopefully it'll stick with someone. So basically today I would like to talk about what I like to call the faux left, or the false left. And it's
easy to run into on the internet, I've noticed.
Oh yeah, it's easy to run into, but it's a strange conglomerate of things that I started to watch over the last 2 years, especially with the pandemic. I had a lot of extra time on my hands. So I started to watch and I started to read more and I started to look more at people that were claiming to be something that clearly they weren't.
Yeah.
For example, let's take our first example. Nathan J. Robinson. It's almost a year and like 2 days.
Yeah, almost.
A month or 2 days since he decided to fire his original staff.
Yeah, I remember that.
And yet, maybe 3 weeks ago, he's back on the Hills Rising show with his friend Brianna Joy, castigating Dan Price for being a immoral CEO. And yet, everything that this guy did, Dan Price, project himself as being the guy who's going to save his company and his employees from the ravages of capitalism.
Of course.
Turns out, in fact, that Nathan J. Robinson is doing. He has a little hissy fit. He wants total control. He wants absolute power, and he wants to make sure that at the end of the day, that everyone knows that it's his magazine and not his workers.
Yes, which is particularly funny because he mostly wrote his stuff and his editors did the editing. He was the boss. Editor-in-chief has, I guess, the final say in everything, but they were operating democratically for a while from his, we became an egalitarian group of friends. Well, why'd you have to ruin it, jackass?
Well, I kind of got from the letters and the open letters that they put out that really wasn't the case, that the egalitarian nature was due to the fact that he couldn't actually pay people.
Yes.
It wasn't like a choice. And in fact, I remember I had a conversation with him via Twitter. And if I could find it, I looked all day. But it's about 15,000 tweets down the list, and I don't know where it is. But he told me, no. Not that they were egalitarian, but they were an actual workers' co-op.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
And this is like a year before.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden it goes boom. And I'm thinking to myself, what happens? How did you do that?
Well, they supposedly had started the process of becoming a co-op. And they never actually got there. And basically, as near as I can understand it from both sides, because I talked somewhat to some of the people on the other end on mutuals with Sparky Abraham and Vanessa B.
Oh, the two that stayed?
I don't believe they stayed, no.
I
haven't seen any Vanessa B stuff since.
I thought they got shifted around and they were there for like the first couple of months after this happened.
No, for the first couple of months after this happened, there weren't any new updates on the site.
I remember that.
And then when it came back, it was just Nathan and a couple of podcasts for a couple of weeks, and then writers' stuff started to show up again. But all the editors, except for Brianna.
Oh yeah,
Brianna Joy Gray came back. She had actually left when the others were fired and had kind words for all of her friends.
I remember that.
And now she's back to collaborating with Nathan.
Well, I mean, it's a good gig. I mean, think about it. It's a great little network she's created herself. He's got what I think on Wikipedia puts his viewership around 100,000 mags a year.
Something like that. And, you know, I got to say, it was good product. I don't agree with some of his more, I didn't agree with some of his more liberal takes on Twitter. And I didn't agree with some of his, well, we have to vote for Democrats and not the Green Party sort of columns.
That's kind of the whole shtick with the
well, you know, but there's a whole thing there, because I know serious, sincere people who still vote Democrat, and I know people who seem like they're serious and sincere, but really all they are is Democrats.
Well, okay, I
and I will say that a lot of people in the who were in the first of those categories are now former Democrats after the 2020 primary. But there are a few people who are still Democrats who I haven't lost all respect for. But there are also people who, yeah, you've shown yourself. The Young Turks, another great example.
Well, I mean, their corruption goes back further than most people think. Everyone thinks it's 2017.
Yeah.
But if you push a little harder, you can find that the first time they took money was actually 2014, and it was from a company operated by Romer, the former Louisiana Republican governor. So, I mean, here's a guy who's claiming that he's about getting out the money from the voting, and he agrees with Romer on that. And then all of a sudden, he takes $4 million, puts a guy from Romer's company on his own board, and that's when you start to see a little shift in the Turks. You know, they're not quite.
Yeah.
You know, there's a little fighting, but they're always like, well, you know, we did the good fight. It didn't work. Now we're back to, you know, just being one of the gang on the blue side. Sorry, it didn't work out. But I've never liked the Young Turks. I've always thought their reporting is hit or miss and too TMZ like. I mean, there was a long period there early on where
I never liked Cenk. I used to think Anna was a good journalist, but not anymore.
I have the exact opposite of her. I've never thought she's a good journalist. Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought she was cover for Cenk when he was in his TMZ heyday with Britney Spears, the whole 2008, 2009 period. And he just, you know, went over and over and over again about her mental decline, which I thought was cruel, actually.
Yes.
And then, you know, but what really sunk her for me was the great incident, and there's a great clip I have to find it somewhere, of her trying to dunk on Charlie Kirk. And she's got and it's this meme of Milton Friedman. It says, it's one of his stupid things about, you know, if the government, you know, controlled the Sahara sand, it would be out of sand in 5 days. Yeah. And she's like, well, who's this old dude? Who's this old dude? And if you look down very carefully, you can see it says Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
You think to yourself, you know, you didn't even do the research enough there to even take the time to look at the graphic and say, oh, well, that's Milton Friedman.
Yeah, well, remember, Milton Friedman is also the guy who said, I prefer a liberal dictatorship to a totalitarian democracy.
Yeah, that one never really, I never quite figured out.
The liberal dictatorship was, of course, Pinochet.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying that always seemed like a contradiction in terms, that quote from him.
Well, that's because it absolutely is, in the sense that that Americans usually use the term liberal.
I know.
But yeah, the capitalism meaning
No, it's fine for that. A free market is he's fine with a free market. But I mean, these also in the 1950s. He wrote a whole essay about how it was okay to segregate schools based
Yes.
on who could afford which one to go to, and that was not a
Yes.
big issue for him. And he pushed for privatization of schools since at least the 1950s.
Oh, yes. Well, possibly. No, I guess the 1950s is when he started really winning prizes and such.
I mean, and he's become sort of the poster boy for the neoliberals now.
Well, and that's the whole thing is his approach to economics basically is the beginning of neoliberalism.
Well, yeah.
He's also sort of Austrian school, but there's nothing.
I mean, that was
There's
his
nothing
idol.
in the Austrian school that's at all incompatible with neoliberalism, even though they hate the word liberal.
Oh, well, yeah. But Hayek was his best friend at the University of Chicago. I mean, the two palled around. The only thing was that Hayek couldn't get a chair in the economics department for some reason. I've never really found out why. But that's but that attitude has permeated all of the media. I mean, when we talk alternative media, what we're just talking are small corporations and not really any other structure that's different. They have all the same vices.
Pretty much. I try to do better, but I'm a tiny little channel with a tiny little viewership, relatively speaking.
Well, that's true, and so am I.
But I mean, I try to be honest as best I can, and I try to be consistent as best I can within the limits of absurdity, because I do have to agree with something Bertrand Russell said, that it's better to be right than to be consistent. I do agree with that, but I generally try to be consistent about my values.
Well, I think you have to be. Otherwise, what are you selling? I mean, isn't that part of the alternative shtick? Is that these are not corporate values? These that we're selling. We're not commodifying the news in exactly the same way. It's a new type of entity that has it's sort of like greening your investment fund.
Yes.
And it turns out that just like green investment funds aren't so green, neither's alternative news all that alternative.
Sadly true.
I mean,
I have occasionally managed to break a story or two, but for the most part, I just want to talk about making the world better, and I think that media critique is more important right now than journalism, though we do need good journalism too. The problem is we need people to curate the news for people more than we need more news sources.
I'm not sure I agree completely with just the curation of news. I think that's where we're running into our problems.
Well, but that's the thing. When I say curation, I mean curation outside the mainstream media, what I would call activist curation.
Oh, okay. Well, that conjures up a different image than just curation.
And this is what I'm talking. And when I say curation, I mean, if you could have enough people spreading the right news and not the wrong news, that could make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
the how is still tricky, but I also think it's tremendously important for people who watch, to have people who watch cable news and explain to you what they're really saying and doing, as opposed to just don't watch it. No, watch it and be aware that this is what they're saying and this is what they mean and this is what they're actually talking about and this is how you know.
All right, so you're looking at more like a fact-checking service.
I'm not even so much fact checking as honest and aggressive partisan criticism.
Well, that too, but I consider that basically fact checking.
True.
Today, you know,
and that's fair.
Right, because, and you're never going to ever get everything 100% because you can't get everyone's perspective no matter what you want. So
exactly.
I'm not one of those crazy people that believes that news has to be ultimately just, a piece of reportage, because it's almost impossible to do.
It's true.
But what I'd like to do is have a little more consistency. So, when you're an alternative media figure and you're deciding that, oh, well, I'm going to go knock on this person because they have X in their closet, you better make sure you don't have that same skeleton as well.
The main thing I try to knock on people for is being egregiously wrong.
Well, that's true.
And I try not to be egregiously wrong, though everybody has bad days, I'm sure. Also, when I am wrong, I try to recognize it and thank people for correcting me, which seems to make a difference sometimes.
Well, I think that's very important. I mean, the ability to say that, yeah, that I didn't have all the information at the time when I said X, or I didn't, or I came at it from this direction. Maybe you weren't wrong, but you just came at it from a different angle of attack.
Sure.
And that makes a big difference. But for me, one of the big problems is are you consistent? And that's a really hard thing to be if you're going to tell me that one day, oh, well, I'm for Joe Biden. I hate Joe Biden. You should never vote for him. And then I read your book, from your first book you publish, and it's all about Joe Biden. I start to think to myself, wait a minute. This is so incongruent that there must be something here. Either A, you're trying to sell me on a new narrative about yourself that just basically fits the current demographic likes of the news in the environment you're working, or you've made a change. But if you made a change, I want to question and ask, how did that change come about? What happened to make that change?
I think that's usually a fair question to ask, too, because people should be able to explain changes in their thinking. I used to be pro-gun control, and then I started reading some of Fannie Lou Hamer's old speeches, and I'm like, she's making sense.
Yeah, gun issue's hard. I mean, there's a lot of problems with it.
There is a legitimate argument to be made that nobody needs assault weapons in a civilized society. But there is also a legitimate argument to be made that this is not a civilized society.
Okay, I can see that. I would have gone that there's a radical power imbalance.
There is a radical power imbalance, and I'm just going to go for the slightly outmoded saying, socialism or barbarism. Well, congratulations, we're in the full tilt barbarism period of capitalism.
Oh yeah, I totally agree that that capitalists are always willing and have proven it over the decades to use violence as their first favorite and best solution to anything.
I would also say that it's very important to understand that whether it's strictly accurate or not, our ruling class literally prides themselves on their descent from barbarians.
Oh, that is true. I mean, that is basically the whole idea of being, chosen by God as the king. Divine right theory is basically that you had some magical power bestowed upon you, and you proved it by vanquishing your foes.
But even in a very simple word, in much more simple language, though, the French crown was based on the idea that the King of France was the heir to Charlemagne.
Right.
Charlemagne was the Frankish king who reestablished some ghost of a Western Roman emperor and empire after there had been none for hundreds of years.
Approximately 400.
And he was one of the barbarians.
Oh yeah, well, but
They were the barbarian successors to Rome, and they reestablished the empire. And these are the people. Charlemagne is the person that the Germans and the French used to fight over who was a better descendant of Charlemagne.
Hard to say. He had a
then
brother.
They both got rid of their royal families, and it became less important.
Well, it became less important. It shifted a little. I mean, the Germans still basically, the Prussians especially, still saw themselves as big heirs to the Holy Roman Empire.
Well, to a certain degree. The Prussians weren't a big believer in the Holy Roman Empire while it was around.
Oh no, not while it was around, but that was their big justification. I mean, for uniting all the
yes,
the principalities and the free states and every other thing that comprised of Germany prior to 1871.
Oh yes, no, I still love Voltaire's quote. It was, of course, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Well, by the time he was alive, it was a little swatch down in Swabia.
Well, no, it was still,
and Naples of all places.
It was still the quote Holy Roman Empire. In Voltaire's day, it was Austria, the various independent German states that were still considered the Holy Roman Empire, even though some of them were allied with Prussia and others kept betraying Austria to France.
That is true. It's funny you brought that up because I was thinking about Charlemagne this afternoon.
Yeah, no, everybody prides themselves on their descent from the barbarians these days. That's where master race theory comes from, is the whole idea that the Aryan barbarians were just better than those short Romans from Italy.
And that brings us to our next victim. Do you have that clip, that piece?
I do have that.
MAGA communism, which is burning up Twitter right now.
I do have that clip. Let me send that to myself here.
That is an interesting. It's almost as good as the liberal dictatorship and totalitarian democracy put together.
It's true.
There it
is. There it is.
Did you try to read through the manifesto of it? As the best.
That's kind of scary.
I read it. I mean, it veers off into Star Wars metaphors. I'm pretty sure you don't want to have Star Wars metaphors in your overall geopolitical basis. I mean, that seems to
probably not.
That seems to be something critical. I mean, that just seems to devolve into a Comic-Con fight between the Yoda fans of the first season and the Yoda fans of the second season. and then you're screwed.
Sometimes
technology.
That's the best you can do. There is one other person I want to touch on before we get to. But that is, since we mentioned Cenk, it is only fair to mention Cenk's opposite number.
Dore?
Jimmy Dore.
Oh, I can't stand him.
I can't stand him either. I can't stand Cenk. They strike me as like bookends of the two worst cranky uncles you can think of for the holidays, one at each end of the table. And of course they hate each other. So everybody has to side with one or the other or hide from them both.
You see, I have this going theory that this whole animosity started off as just a really clever ploy.
Yes.
To boost Twitter. And then all of a sudden someone went just a little too far. And I can't decide whether it was Cenk or whether it was Dore. But it doesn't seem like there's much there. I mean, they've both done the same bad reporting. They have people on their shows. They don't read their books. They just foster whatever message they want on them. For example, Dore had Caitlin Johnstone on it, and she got to tell all about the Black Panther movement, supposedly with the racist with the racist Ku Klux Klan, which is a total fraud.
So, and this is a big deal, and more people should understand this. If you do a Google search for Young Patriots Organization, one of the top 3 sites that comes up is actually curated by relatives of the surviving founders.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. You can actually read about the Young Patriots and the Black Panthers and the Young Lords on the Young Patriots' own website.
None of them were racist.
Well, I mean, so
maybe some individual members were. But
this is where you get into the real critical race theory arguments about whether or not anybody who considers whiteness the default normal state is at least a little bit racist because they have that belief of living in a white society and of whiteness is normal. But all that aside, you get into the question of what is and isn't racist, and you can say that there were almost certainly racisms occurring between membership of the Young Patriots and membership of other groups. But what is important is that because they were not actively racist people, when those racisms occurred, like people being really bothered by the Confederate flag at a few events, they listened and they said, we won't use that Confederate flag anymore if it bothers people in that neighborhood so much.
Well, yeah. Well, but I mean, the Confederate flag was their way of trying to draw in other people from the
South.
They wanted to create a bridge. Just happened that they picked a pretty terrible image for it, but there really isn't any too canonical Southern imagery that you can use that really is great. I mean, you can't use Robert E. Lee and say that's a great one. You might.
Well, and really, that's the problem is that there isn't all of the Southerners who would have been available to offer that kind of folklore were killed or run out of the South and shut out of the making of the Southern folklore.
The closest you could get is maybe Longstreet,
who became a Republican after the war,
and a Catholic in Louisiana from his third way, and then he supported the Black riots during the 1877. That's the only one you can get away with, but it's so rare. No one really thinks of Longstreet after like the Battle of Vicksburg.
There's somebody else like no, because that wasn't a Confederate state. That's Kentucky, and that's a little different. But there were
in Kentucky. I can tell you that it is both a Confederate state and a Yankee state at the same time.
I know Tennessee is the same way.
I went to the University of Louisville, and every time you crossed over, I don't know if it's still there. I'm going back recently. I have to find out. But there was this 1895, with Daughters of the Confederacy, Wives of the Confederacy monument in between the university and Frat Row.
Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't miss it. That was the main way to campus too. So you went past it all the time. What
really bugs me though is the fact that the Confederate flag is so popular these days in the states who sent the troops that were known as the Iron Brigade, who were mostly abolitionists from violently Republican and in those days radical Republican states. Like Indiana, which I guess is still Republican, but not in the right way anymore.
No. Or even, the German immigrants of that period were radical abolitionists.
Not even just abolitionists. Several of the what's his name? Why can't I keep his? Franz Seigel. Franz Seigel was a socialist revolutionary in the 1840s German Revolution. He
moved to Missouri.
He moved to the U.S. along with several other German socialists. So there were at least 3 German socialists who fought in the German Revolution in the 1840s. Mm-hmm. Seigel, the one I remember best, who were all Union generals in the Civil War.
They were, and I mean, the only reason why Missouri stayed a Union state was because of the German radical abolitionists, and most of them had been
Also,
in the 1840 revolution.
Also because of Nathaniel Lyon, which is kind of an interesting story. The three most famous words in the English language, though people probably imagine them as Bugs Bunny saying them, might be "This means war." And of course, when the governor of Missouri called upon the only federal fort in the state to surrender, Captain Nathaniel Lyon, who was in command of the fort, said that you cannot, I will not sit here and allow you to dictate terms to my government. This means war.
That's a good story. But I mean, but the Germans were incredibly instrumental in maintaining that state as a Union state.
And the German abolitionists were a great deal of the manpower for abolitionist guerrillas in Missouri, the same way that that farmers who had moved up from the South and lived in the more rural parts were the backbone of the pro-Confederate guerrillas.
But I mean, that was all erased though after the St. Louis Commune of 1878.
Yeah,
they went out of their way to just destroy that historical point. Mm-hmm. And that state basically reverted into a southern state after the war. Hard.
Well, look at West Virginia. West Virginia seceded from Virginia to get in order to stay in the U.S. and not join the Confederacy. We're the only state of all the slave states going into the Civil War. West Virginia was the only one to voluntarily abolish slavery in its constitution prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, and was accepted into the Union as a free state during the war.
Unlike Delaware.
Yes.
Which was one of the states that had carved out itself from the Emancipation Proclamation as a non.
Yes. Well, because Lincoln was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation under war powers that allowed him to confiscate enemy property, which meant that he could not emancipate any slaves who were owned by his allies or supporters.
That's right. Convenient. I mean, there is a case that he might have been able to, but he would have had to expand the war powers slightly.
He would have had to, well, I mean, so let's be honest.
And he wasn't about to do that.
If Abe Lincoln had really wanted to, he could have easily been a dictator. Mm-hmm. He suspended a lot of constitutional rights in and around D.C. during the war. Though I've always found it interesting that if you really read about it, the people who were most affected by restrictions on free expression during the Civil War were elites who were pro-slavery and pro-Confederacy. And they were also the ones bitching about free speech.
I mean, you can't have it both ways sometimes. But I mean, that's the point. There just wasn't a very strong basis in the South to have any other symbol of connection other than the battlefield flag. Because they had spent the last 70 years erasing anybody from the history books that didn't.
And they said patriots because patriot was a word that young white people recognized as being good. You want to be a patriot like George Washington or whomever.
And, and that was an interesting thing. But, I mean, if we looked at it critically, we should have people like Jimmy Dore say, no, Caitlin, we're not building a bridge between people that believe in white supremacy. These are really more allies, and they have a much closer core belief system than we do with, say, MAGA or...
Well, Jimmy should have done the research to know that.
Well, he doesn't do research. He admits it every time. It's a joke. Well, I don't read that much. It shows you don't read that much. I mean, and even when he does read, I don't think he understands it.
Well, I mean, how much can somebody who believes that he's standing up for freedom by backing Lori Lightfoot over Chicago teachers when she's trying to force them back into the classroom, and they say, well, we're not sure the classroom's safe for the kids.
Oh,
and Jimmy Dore ends up saying, Lori Lightfoot is right. Those teachers should get back to work. It's like, dude, now you're talking about breaking a strike.
well, not only a strike, which is something that he's all about. 2 years ago, he was all about labor rights.
Yep, I remember that.
And calling for a general strike.
Mm-hmm.
Every time he turned around, he said general strike. Someone sneezed, and it was, oh, better have a general strike.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's, strikes are bad. He's on Tucker Carlson every time you turn around.
Well, he's always gone on Tucker. He's gone on Tucker for a long time now.
He has.
And there are people who would have told you a few years ago, and a few years ago, maybe I would have agreed with them. But there are people who say, well, he doesn't go in and play to Tucker's narrative.
Oh,
he goes in and says his stuff, but he totally plays to Tucker's narrative.
There's only one man I've ever seen who didn't play to Tucker's narrative, and you've never seen the interview live. The historian Rutger Bregman.
I know who you mean, yeah.
I mean, that's
everybody showed that recorded.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't think Bernie really played to Tucker's narrative.
Oh, well, okay, maybe Tucker. But I'm talking about somebody who's not a politician like
True.
that, who knows that he doesn't have he knows that he doesn't have to worry about his base being really bothered by it.
Yeah.
Bregman is, he's an historian. This would be a huge boon to be on Tucker every 2 weeks, getting 10 grand a pop or whatever they pay for these guys to show up.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He told it like it was. And you've seen it. I mean, everyone has done it.
Also, secret. I know this from talking to some people. They don't pay you shit to show up.
Well, you can become a paid.
If you become a contributor, they pay you.
That's right.
But if you are just a guest, you
don't get paid for being a guest unless you're special, very special.
Mm-hmm.
Then
well, and even then, they don't admit to it. That happens through back channels.
It does. I know a couple of guys who've gotten paid to go on because they're just so obstreperous that they just wouldn't show up without a bag of money. But
that's what I'll say if Tucker ever wants me on. Dude, if you want me to sell out, pay up. I know you're good for it. You're going to have the frozen vegetable money.
It's chicken. It's Swanson.
Yes, I know. I got that wrong on purpose because he should not. It's like if I really believe that if I were going to try to insult Daniel Goldman, I believe that I would call him the Jordache heir.
Oh. Jordache, because it was the lesser of the genes of the 1980s gene wars.
Jordache was the girls' genes. I mean, they did some men's stuff too, but mostly Jordache made women's genes.
Did they? I don't remember.
Yes. If you remember the old joke about whether you had a fly or a zipper.
Oh yeah.
The male genes have the classic design we all know with either snaps or zipper in the fly. The women's genes instead had a zipper down the side.
That's right. I forgot about that. I haven't thought of Jordache in years. Did they finally go out of business?
I don't even remember. I'm sure they did.
But yeah, but
so many companies did.
But that's the case. I mean, a lot of these people, have been turning these alternative media gigs into full-time gigs as paid contributors on these other networks.
Well, Goldman, it's gross. Goldman went from being an MSNBC contributor to doing this stuff for the Democrats in Congress that was specifically done because, hey, this guy goes on the good news shows. If we hire him, we'll get good treatment from MSNBC.
Oh, but it's the same clique inside the alternative news media.
Oh,
you don't say something bad about a guy like Nathan J. Robinson because he's got a big magazine.
Yeah, you don't badmouth anybody on the we're left, but we're sticking with the Democrats side, unless you're in with somebody on the Jimmy Dore side.
Or, yeah, you could. I mean, that's the factionalization.
If you're if you're trying to make a living at independent media anyway.
Yeah, because you don't want to become iced out.
I know people who've gotten very successful very fast.
Oh, sure.
By being friendly with Jimmy Dore. And I would say that the biggest reason I haven't gotten really successful as fast is because I
just can't bring yourself to being friendly.
This is not good. Well, it's like when he was bending all over himself to try to explain how Tulsi Gabbard backing off Medicare for all wasn't really that bad.
I remember that. That was a clear sign of his allegiances being.
That was when he blocked me the first time.
Oh, he blocked you. He's never blocked me.
And then he unblocked me and followed me during the force the vote thing.
Now, that was when he was trying to get everybody and anybody to retweet his tweets during force the vote.
And then he blocked me again when I was calling him out about the anti-vax stuff.
Yeah, well.
And this is the one thing. This introduces me. This introduces us to our next guest.
In absentia.
Yes. Where is it? I used to know where my.
Yeah,
there it is.
That's a huge change he shifted 2 years ago. He started the pandemic out with everybody should get $500 a week, and
here we go.
And everyone should get a mask and a vax and everything else. And then next thing you know, he's screaming to that it's all.
So here it is. I don't know how well people can see this, so I'm going to make it bigger. This might be hard to read depending on the size of the screen, so I'm going to read this for you. This is MAGA communism. Now, I'm going to pop back here for a moment to mention that the reason we are talking about MAGA communism is we have here we go, share. No, why is it not? That's better. Share. That's better. So here we go. Okay, where is it? There we go. Is that the one? There we go. Perfect. So here we are. Now, how big does this show up? Because I don't think
big on my screen.
Okay, cool. Now, this was tweeted by Jackson Hinkle, who started out, as I understand it, as a Biden supporter and a liberal.
Well, I thought he was a Bernie bro originally.
He switched and ended up Bernie. He ended up Bernie. I don't remember exactly when. I don't think he really started talking about Bernie until after Biden won, but I could be wrong. I remember that he was involved in Force the Vote, as so many people were.
I remember that. That's where he really started to gain followers and make a name for himself.
Yes, and it was during Force the Vote that so many people who are now what I would call as part of the sheepdogging for Republicans as opposed to sheepdogging for Democrats side of things. So many of them started making friends with each other and Force the Vote, and all changed their politics around the same time through mediums like, let's get together with the Boogaloo Boys. And then let's be anti-vax.
You know, I mean, the sad part is you can probably find people in Boogaloo Boys that you could turn, but uniting with the actual organization is a fool's errand.
Well, and what's more is I believe, and other people have suggested the same, and you gotta, I don't like to scream it out too loud, but you gotta figure that there were people in the Boogaloo Boys who deliberately wanted to become friendly with people on the left in order to not help very much, if you get my drift.
Oh well, there's always that crossover infiltration
And
possible.
and that would sure explain a lot of this MAGA communism bullshit.
It does. It does. I mean, it's
So
and
right up
the
here,
profitability.
reindustrialization of America. Now, I have various views about things like NAFTA, but the global supply chain is not something that people can just stop at the drop of a hat. It's a system that has to be dismantled or universalized. It can't just, you can't just change all of a sudden.
Well, I think if you're a true Marxist, I mean, the goal is to universalize it.
Exactly.
It's to stop denying that the South you need less than $17 or $18 an hour, and they deserve the same amount. And then
Exactly.
Ricardo's so-called comparative advantage really works out.
Yes.
Because it's about whether or not that group actually has some comparative advantage in resources or materials that makes operating there better, instead of just exploitation of the workforce.
Exactly. And
which is what
exploitation of the workforce is the whole reason behind trade and supply chains right now.
Oh, it is. It's been that way. I mean, we hit the 1970s. We hit a wall in industry. We could the cost was going up. The products were becoming too expensive, and the profits were getting too low.
Yep.
And that's why you have the Ford Pinto being such a piece of junk and going on fire, and Coca saying, well, run the numbers, and if it doesn't work, we'll pay it off. If it pays us.
And then you've got dismantle big tech.
Well, I don't understand what that means, because right across from it, kind of like
nationalize big tech.
So are we nationalizing it, or are we dismantling it?
Well, I believe when they say dismantle, I believe what they're actually talking about is the surveillance industrial complex.
Well, doesn't that just go with abolish FBI, CIA, NSA?
Well, if you just abolished all those alphabet agencies but didn't deal with surveillance capitalism, then you just have all the surveillance capitalists working directly for the local cops and the U.S. attorneys.
I've done a lot of research on that lately, because our new congressman for the District 19 in New York, Pat Ryan, is neck deep in companies like Data Miner, which we all remember from 2020 when they were proven to be looking for George Floyd protesters on Twitter. And that was an FBI operation. I just don't think the local police have the money. Well, they didn't until.
Well, they have lots of federal money now.
They have lots of federal money now.
Plus, like anywhere from 30 to 60% of their city's budget in most cases.
It is, and it's only getting worse.
Only getting worse. They upped. This is the grossest thing ever. They gave the Uvalde cops more money after the massacre.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the Uvalde cops were thinking or what their plan was during that.
Their plan was apparently to wait, let the guy kill some people, then go in and kill him and, say, we need more money. This is such a tragedy.
Was that the plan? I don't know. To me,
it seems to have worked.
Well, that part of it worked.
The plan, it was a happy accident.
I mean, it seemed to me that essentially what we had there was a bunch of cops that, realized that they didn't really want to be in a firefight.
They were scared. After all their macho bullshit, they were scared to go up against someone armed. And you hear excuses like, well, we didn't have the shields. And then you show a picture of the shields.
I know. They had the shields. They had the body armor. They had the plate carriers. They had everything you need.
And now here's another one. Ban Antifa street terrorism.
Yes, that brings us back to, again, to 2020 of the summer.
Apparently, MAGA is that special pro-cop communism.
And, it doesn't like bricks, apparently, either. Remember the Antifa brick theory?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm surprised we don't see, ban all bricks from private use.
Expand stable, high-yielding energy.
That's another.
Oil/nuclear.
That's
Now,
another.
what's stable about unrenewable resources?
Absolutely nothing, as far as I can see.
See, and that's the thing. So the word stable, and then they say high-yielding.
Well,
So
that's true.
The fun fact is, of course, solar and wind have the same return on investment, money in, energy out, as nuclear. It's not more efficient.
But I think what they're talking about stability is that wind, and solar always claim that due to the fact that, daylight, nighttime cycles, but that's a storage issue.
That's a storage issue, and the storage issues
they can be solved.
They can be solved, and we can build. I mean, if we're going to be, and I'm not saying we should, I'm absolutely against this, let's be clear, but we have a government that is planning to carve up the map of the world based on who has lithium and who doesn't. And we're going to invade all the countries with lithium eventually. And
buy them.
But despite the fact that they're making this map, in the Pentagon somewhere, at the same time, despite their plans to steal all the lithium, they're not saying, hey, let's make better batteries.
Oh, no. In fact, they already know the lithium batteries has reached its peak performance-wise. My brother's in the car industry, and I was reading a paper that he sent me that about they've reached the peak performance on the lithium battery. They know already that there's just nothing they can squeeze out of it.
Well, a lot of the performance,
except for heat.
A lot of the performance is pretty good. I don't have any complaints about electric cars. The thing is, number one, it's still a capitalism-driven for-profit industry.
Sure.
It's still not a renewable resource.
No, it's not.
You still have to dig lithium out of the ground.
But you're also losing. It's a diminishing return on how big the battery cells become weight-wise compared to the overall mass of the car, and which gives you your energy density.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. I mean, besides, who's going to want to have like a couple containers behind their house with like 50 billion lithium ion cells to power your house during half the week? Because Newsom decides in California, for example, to cut half the power off because he can't afford to tax them enough to make the energy grid work. And there's no water for the Hoover Dam.
Well, isn't the point of the energy grid being private that it doesn't have to be supported by taxation?
Oh, that was the myth, like 50 years ago.
That was the lie. We're all going to be paying this private company for our electricity, so taxes won't come into it.
That's that, and then that was the who was it? Enron. Enron was the first big one that said, "Oh no. What you really have to do is you have to privatize it. We got to get rid of those public, quasi-public companies and give us just the true privatization." And then we see Texas.
Yeah.
Every time they have winter or too much sun or too many electric cars now are going to just end that grid. In fact, in my home state of New York, we're paying $7 billion to run a power line from Canada down to New York City because they don't really trust the fact that we shut down the Peekskill nuclear power plant. What was that? That was point. I'll think of it in a second. That power plant we shut down, right? So that made a quarter of all the power to the New York metro area.
Mm-hmm.
So we could have replaced it with other things. We could have created a better grid in the first place that's more efficient.
Yeah.
We could have done all of those things, but we didn't because just didn't pay. But we privatized.
Nobody wanted to disrupt the operations of the financial capital of the world.
Oh, no. No one's going to stop that, especially not Chuck Schumer.
And especially not Chuck Schumer.
That's the reason why we call him around town the Wall Street's favorite Democrat.
Well, I mean, and that's only because Hillary isn't in office anymore.
No, she was never quite as friend. She was friendly, but Chuck was always.
Well, yeah, Wall Street senator.
I mean, my God, his first couple of jobs were basically as a lawyer to those large corporations. I mean, he did a little time. He did a little time in the public defender's office early on to get like that street cred that you're one of the people.
You know who else was a public defender at the beginning of his career? Joe Biden.
Yes, he was. I feel so.
You know why?
It looks good when you run for office.
No. I would love to accuse him of being that manipulative, but it's not true in this case. I'm going to go ahead and put on my elitist liberal hat.
Okay.
So at the time Joe Biden graduated from law school, he graduated from the University of Delaware, not Harvard or Yale or some similarly prestigious Ivy or Ivy adjacent school. He graduated from the University of Delaware. He also graduated close to the bottom of his class.
Oh no.
At the time, the public defender's office was the only paying legal job that would hire somebody who graduated near the bottom of his class at the University of Delaware. Now, we rightly extol public defenders now for lots of reasons, and because of some romantic ideas and because of some specifically really good public defenders who have kind of become celebrities. At the same time, it's important to remember that a public defender is often, at least traditionally, not the best lawyer around because they can all get better paying jobs with real benefits. In fact, one of the three public defenders offices in two of the three public defenders offices in your city were specifically opened up to break a union in the public defenders.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if you're any good at it, you don't stay very long in the trenches before you figure out how to get to and whisper into the DA and work your way up politically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I agree, but I mean, so I don't really know why Biden, other than his incompetence.
I mean, and really, that's what it was. Is that was the job he could get as a lawyer. He started becoming involved in politics very soon afterwards.
Well, I mean, he wasn't going to really push up the old DA list.
No,
I mean, I don't see him winning any DAs contests anywhere.
He was an independent, and he was an independent whose first real impact in Delaware politics was to back the liberal Nelson Rockefeller Republican who was anti-segregation against the Dixiecrat who was governor of Delaware at the time.
Yeah.
That was his entry into politics. He was an independent. He made a big deal of it. And then he immediately became a Democrat because he had to be a Democrat to be elected county supervisor.
Yeah, I remember that.
And when he was a county supervisor, he had the best idea. I'll give Joe Biden credit for this. He had the best idea that any liberal had ever had, as far as desegregating schools, which was very specific. We should bring the projects out to the suburbs. He actually said it. We need to build affordable housing in the suburbs to get black families out here and desegregate our schools.
Well, that'll end that one.
That didn't end up passing, of course.
No surprise.
And once he was in the Senate, and maybe he believed that this would somehow force states or counties to put projects in the suburbs, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Of course, in the Senate, the first famous thing he did was ban mandatory busing.
That's right, he did. And there's a famous quote of his in that
Yes.
memo about, "I'm not going to send my children to any racial jungles."
I don't want my kids in a racial jungle. Yes.
Which, of course, that's actually true. His whole I mean, in '87, he was forced on television to finally admit that he never went to anything remotely like a demonstration.
Mm-hmm. No, he was an
Did you ever read-
establishment guy.
Did you ever read that some of the accounts of the '87 around Delaware, where he wrote this long article castigating welfare queens? His own term, he used this borrowed term from Reagan.
Of course he did.
And he was a little softer. It wasn't quite their fault, but we couldn't. But you had to wean them off of the government for their own good.
Well, that was the core democratic belief going all the way back to the why can't I remember? Neoconservative Moynihan.
Yeah.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous
Also
memo
from
to
New York.
Lyndon Johnson, which was literally waiting on Johnson's desk after his inauguration when he was reelected as president for having passed civil rights legislation in the end of JFK's term, and then had this report waiting for him on why we need to stop helping Black people as quickly as we possibly can.
We don't want to I think it says something to the effect like, we don't want to make this a trend that becomes generational.
That's what they were basically saying. We don't want people to become dependent on public assistance.
Yeah, that was a sweet one. But I mean, that also fits great into this MAGA. I mean, I think he's got something in there about, more growth and somewhere else, business growth.
Let me go through this list. I know he said, it was awful, but he said that basically, and he used a lot more words, but it really did break down to what I said in my tweet. Yep. He said, essentially, communism is when more businesses open.
That's right. That's what he does say. We're the pro-growth communism.
Now, what's funny is that this idea about communism meaning there's more business is related to China's policy to encourage more small business owned by Chinese people in China, as opposed to chain restaurants owned by Western corporations. Right. So China is doing this to decolonize its economy, and he's sitting around saying, we need to help entrepreneurs the way China is so we can be more communist.
I know. Well, I mean, personally, I find calling China communist at this point kind of a oxymoron in itself.
So this is a show. This is a topic worthy of its own show with like 3 or 4 people to talk about it, and one of them with an actual PhD in China. But all that aside, there's lots of things you can say about China. I will say that the one thing that more than anything else makes me believe that China is still a communist country where it matters is their COVID policy, where they simply stood up and said, we're going to make a decision to put our citizens' lives over our economic numbers.
True.
And, somebody might have said a few years ago, well, that's not such a big deal. But we know now it's a huge deal. The so-called social democracies of the Nordic countries relied on this brutal eugenics policy for COVID, where they just let people get sick.
Sweden mostly.
Mostly Sweden.
The others did tamp it down. I mean, Norway did do lots of lockdowns. So did Finland. But Finland's technically not part of the Nordic. No. I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean,
it is and it isn't.
I mean, when they feel like they decide that they're part of the Scandinavian, when they don't, they don't. And Denmark right now has just totally decided that we don't need anything. We're going Swedish style.
Yes.
And
well, they didn't all do it right away, but eventually both Norway and Denmark have jumped on. We're opening everything up, damn it, just like Sweden.
Well, I mean,
though, and this is the part that makes me just smile. Apparently, we're fighting our war with Russia in Ukraine for Norway. And the reason I say this is because the price of gas in Europe has gone up even more than the price of gas in the US, because more of their gas was coming from Russia and now it's not.
And Norway's got the largest stocks.
Norway is now the one selling them gas and oil instead of Russia. And Norway has said, no, we don't have a special NATO price because we're allies and we're fighting a war in the middle of where you were going to build your pipeline. We're still going to charge you the normal price. Sorry.
Wait, market value. What can we do?
Exactly. Capitalism.
Which always brings me back to the big issue of the Nordic nations. And that brings me to that little fine quote from Bhaskar Sunkar.
Yes.
About how, capitalism, we just have to find a mechanism to for the producers and the capitalists to work things out. And there are
socialized production.
Socialized production. We already well, if you did that, you wouldn't have any capitalists.
Now, mind you, if you really want to talk about socializing production, I mean, that would be the sort of Chinese nationalize everything model.
That would be the old Maoist model.
And even beyond that, this is the other thing that gives me some reason to say that whether or not you like the whole state authority thing, that China really does try to do the whole anti-capitalist thing. What other country in the world do you know that punishes billionaires for crimes like everybody else?
Yeah, we haven't heard from Jack Ma too much these days. Not since his little Hong Kong dispute. Well, I mean, is that about billionaires or is that about China just trying to finally show that
China has jailed and executed their own billionaires?
Oh, I know they have.
For fairly serious financial crimes that would have been like, oh yeah, good job among the club here.
Well, it would have been a small fine to pay.
Yeah, they would have had to pay a fine less than what they stole.
Of course.
And everybody would have said, you're a really smart guy behind closed doors.
Yeah, JP Morgan comes to mind.
Well, Donald Trump comes to mind because the big thing that they didn't like about Donald Trump is he was talking too much about what went on behind closed doors.
In 2016, when he made his famous speech during the debates and said, I buy them and I expect to get results from my politicians. That was truly classic.
It really was.
But it turns out he was bought too by the other billionaires.
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing, though. Is it bought or is it just class loyalty? Because sure, they don't like each other on a social level, but they all make money off the same stuff.
Oh, yeah, of course it's class loyalty.
That's why he and Steve Wynn pretended to be friends for years, even though they hated each other.
And if he could have, he would have been friends with Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but he wanted them to kowtow too much now that he was president.
Yeah, well, that's the whole problem, too, is that, you can't expect people who are richer than you to kowtow to you in this society, no matter who you are.
I mean, if you have a firm control over the government, you might be able to get it, but he clearly didn't.
Well, and I mean, even then, if you really want to make someone rich kowtow, you have to be able to use the whole force of the government against them, the way that
Chinese do.
The way that people went after Rockefeller and Standard Oil.
Yeah, it took him a long time. He did skip around the country for about 2 years before they finally got him in court.
And then they also got Morgan. Since you mentioned Morgan, is the famous conversation between Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan playing golf after Roosevelt wasn't president anymore, and Morgan was like, "You broke up my banking monopoly and my railroad monopoly. Why did you leave my steel monopoly alone? And Roosevelt said, because your steel monopoly wasn't crooked. Which is not to say that it was or it wasn't. It was that Teddy Roosevelt was of the opinion that a steel monopoly was good for national security.
It was, well, yeah. He felt that he could at least hold over the steel monopoly, the threat of being broken up, so they would, they would be able to. But no monopoly is good, which is a question about his.
Well, I believe that's true under capitalism. I believe there are situations there. I believe there are certain things that are public goods that should be monopolized. If we're going to have a state, it should be monopolized by the state and not privatized in any way. But that's the real problem.
But I don't consider that a monopoly.
Well, but that's the real problem, is the not privatized in any way is almost unsustainable anymore.
Only because we choose to.
True.
I mean, that's the big thing. It's just a choice.
Well, that was the whole problem of neoliberalism because you have to remember, what was the reason we switched from race to the bottom to building some of the best stuff in the world? What was the reason for the switch?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First was
profitability is the biggest.
Profitability and stagflation were the two biggest issues of the late 60s, early 70s.
Mm-hmm. And the stagflation was primarily caused by the fact that Germany and Japan were catching up to us.
Yeah, well, if you believe in like Hyman Minsky, it was the fact that the companies started to purchase more and more of their own stock.
Yes, well, I mean, and that's not wrong either. You can see it in the period before 1973 and the period after 1973. Oh, yeah. Best example is Boeing. Boeing was a company run by engineers whose CEOs were engineers and whose boards of directors were retired engineers and who had retired airline pilots on their board because they wanted people who flew the planes and knew the planes from the end of flying them and all this other stuff. And then one day they decided, we're getting really whipped. We're still in business, but we really need to be making our stockholders more money. So let's just fire all these engineers and hire MBAs and accountants.
That's right. Yeah, there's another critical thing. They got kind of iced out for about 30 years out of the most lucrative bit. The airlines are not as lucrative as defense.
Oh, I know. But that was the whole thing, though, is that because they were their primary focus was on civil aviation.
Yeah.
They did civil aviation better than anybody else in the world until they started getting lazy.
And competition. Airbus. Yeah. Airbus was a big problem.
Airbus was a big problem, but Airbus started to be a problem around the same time that that the people at Boeing started to get fat and well-fed and lazy and not really hungry anymore.
And let's be honest, the salt talks got them. I mean, their big product was the B-52, and they were no longer selling that. Which was
sort of a thinly veiled secret that the nuclear bombers were what paid for the civil aviation.
That was it. And then you started to see that. I mean, and Lockheed had the same problem, but they managed to buy up General Dynamics and everybody
Lockheed else. and McDonnell Douglas, who were Boeing's competition in the civil airfield, both ended up getting out of the civil airfield and going completely into military. McDonnell Douglas, like the year before, they got bought out by whoever bought them out.
Boeing.
Yeah, it was Boeing. And then
that's how Boeing got all the defense contracts.
And then Lockheed went.
Yeah, Lockheed
military only.
Yeah, well, but they had gotten a lot of deals during that Boeing didn't get. I mean, fighter project after fighter project. I have a thing for aviation.
No, I used to love jet fighters when I was a kid. I will admit that. I thought jet fighters were cool.
I like all aviation. Doesn't matter. If it's cool, it's cool. And you got to admit that the Russians did an amazing thing during like the 1930s. I mean, they went from like horse and wagon to making some of the biggest aircraft in the world, and it was just, and that was
they
pure.
built and the whole thing is building the factories in the short amount of time they did, and then producing the material of war in the short amount of time they did, and in some cases moving the factories.
That's right. During World War II, they moved them all past the Urals to fix. But I mean there's a lot of power in the communist system. That planned economy that people don't like to talk about. Even here in America, we did it, and we don't like to talk about it.
A sitting state representative in New York, someone who will probably never be one of Wall Street's favorite Democrats, Ron Kim, said to me that Wall Street is absolutely terrified of the idea of modern monetary theory. And the reason Wall Street is terrified from it is because they already know that's how the government props their markets up. And if the government started doing that directly, instead of laundering it through Wall Street, there would be no reason for Wall Street anymore.
No, there wouldn't. There wouldn't. And that would probably take out 3 or 4 little checks on MAGA Commons list. We wouldn't have to worry about insider trading. I'm sure they got something about that. I don't understand that list. It's almost laughable.
Well, I mean,
like, what's with the subsidized gyms?
I know what that is. I know exactly what that is. My guess is that Jackson thinks his membership should be free and his gym won't give it to him for free.
He's not famous enough. He hasn't done enough. He doesn't have enough viewers. He can't go to Planet Fitness and be like, "Hey, let's cut a deal here." He doesn't
get the special celebrity membership for free the way.
Or maybe he doesn't get the good trainers.
Maybe also possible.
I don't know. I thought that was a hugely interesting thing to add. It seemed like just some random we should have subsidized gyms.
Literacy movement. Now, see, why would we need a literacy movement? If we become communist, we're teaching everybody to be literate because we have good education like communist countries do, where we teach everybody like they might have the potential to become an intellectual or an engineer if that's what they're good at.
That is true. And it's cheaper in the long run. I mean, no one really understands that education is much, much cheaper than non-educated because those people can expand your economy. They can solve new problems. They don't become a burden.
Well, and
you're trying to find these low-end jobs that are being pushed
what was
out.
the number one problem in the Gilded Age? And it doesn't get talked about a lot because for the most part, capitalists still controlled things. But one of the big problems in the Gilded Age and the period before it that led to the Gilded Age was inventors kind of had too good a gig. If you could invent something and it worked well enough to land you the patent first, you were going to make money. To the point that our 2 most famous quote unquote inventors in history are Alexander Graham Bell, who may have been second to invent the telephone, but was first to hire the best patent lawyer.
Well,
and of course Thomas Edison, who never met an invention he didn't buy
or steal.
Mostly bought. Well, not even necessarily bought. If you think of Marvel,
well, what I meant by steal was that
hire agreement.
What I meant
if you just hire the smartest man and the smartest electrical engineer in the world at the time, and put your name on what he makes for you, it worked for Westinghouse too.
Which one? Are you talking about Nikola Tesla? Or are you talking about Charles Proteus Steinmetz, who also...
Well, I'm particularly talking about Tesla, who famously quit Edison to go to work for Westinghouse and completely changed the balance of power.
Now, Westinghouse was a real inventor on his own.
Mm-hmm. His
Unlike,
air brake was revolutionary.
yes, it was. And he's from a little city just above where I live called
Right.
Schenectady.
Yeah, I know. I've been to Schenectady, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
I feel for you.
I will say,
It was a lot nicer 50 years ago when GE was still there.
I gotta say, I will say that in an industrial town that polluted, they never should have built all those buildings out of brick. Because brick buildings with 40 or 50 years of pollution on them are like the ugliest things ever. But I mean, and that's the,
and they stick around.
yeah.
They don't fall apart and crumble.
Which is good. You don't want stuff to crumble, but
if it's that when it's got that much PCBs in it, you might want it to crumble and be taken away.
That's a good point.
You don't want to be like, what did I touch? Was that just the lead paint, or was that the PCBs from GE spraying it all over the place for the last 100 years almost? Yeah, but I mean, everyone was there.
But yeah, Westinghouse invented the air brake, but he did not invent alternating current. That was Nikola Tesla.
That was Nikola Tesla. But who did all the math to make Nikola Tesla's thing work out really well was actually Proteus Steinmetz.
True.
And then there's that great story of him at the Ford plant where he's like there for 2 weeks. And like at the end of the day, he puts this X on this big generator and he tells them take out like 18 inches of coil from here and it'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And then they gives the bill and the bill says $10,000 and Ford calls up Edison and screams at him, what does this mean? And so he says, I want an itemized bill. And the itemized bill comes back 99 cents for the chalk, $9,999.99 for knowing where to put the X.
Yeah. That's important.
It is. Well, that was like the best. Again, another guy he bought from Austria that time.
Exactly. Well, and again, like I said, Edison never meant an invention he didn't buy, or an inventor he didn't buy if he could.
But he stole some from his workers. He took credit for a lot of the stuff.
Yeah, the light bulb was something he took credit for from one of his first employees.
I know. I mean, that was what I was getting at, is that he had all those employees, but he took so much credit. After a while, he didn't do anything. He just stamped his name on it,
and fun fact, Edison and his empire are gone.
That's true.
And yet, the guy who invented the lamp socket to put the light bulb in, his company is still around.
That is true.
Isidore Levitin.
Yeah, but that was a whole big issue. The light socket. I mean, everybody had a different type of socket at one point in the 1900s. You couldn't put anything in anywhere. You plug one in, and if you were at Edison house, you were stuck on Edison light bulbs, which brings us right back to like the big tech concept here.
And that's where that Gilded Age with things like electricity and ships starting to be a big deal because you had gasoline instead of coal, diesel instead of coal, all that stuff happening is huge. And it was and the people who made the biggest money controlled the technology, just like now.
Yeah. And they controlled the lobbies that supported it.
And Elon Musk is like your sort of Rockefeller or your Morgan, who just slides around buying everything and doesn't worry about inventing anything himself. Of course, they're all more like that these days. I don't think you can even find a Thomas Edison anymore who at least has the good sense to steal employees' work rather than steal it from someone else and take credit.
Yeah, that's a good question. Who's really doing anything? I mean,
there's no Westinghouse anymore, I don't think.
I mean, the last one probably was Wozniak out of Apple.
Wozniak. But Wozniak wasn't the Apple partner who got richest.
No, he wasn't. But he did get fired first.
Yes, he did.
I shouldn't say fired. He was technically asked to resign.
Bill Gates, who everyone likes to talk about as being some sort of computer genius,
Oh God.
made his fortune, and most people don't remember this. DOS was licensed to Microsoft from another company that Bill Gates was
Missouri.
paying. Yeah.
$50,000.
Yeah.
That's what he paid for the original license. He put that guy out of business so that he didn't have to pay the license anymore. But he got a sweet deal with IBM. What were they thinking? Because that's where, from New York, you're in IBM town, right? Everywhere is here. It's IBM. And they were thinking hardware.
Yes. Which ended up being absolutely the wrong way to think about it. Because look what happened to Apple with their focus on hardware and their own proprietary operating system. And
well, that's kind of worked out in the long run well for them.
Only because they made the decision to diversify in such a way that if you had one of their products, you could not avoid eventually getting sucked into more of their products.
I know. I'm sitting on a Mac right now.
I had a Mac when I was a kid. My first computer was this Apple II clone called a Syscom. But
it didn't last very long. Apple was crazy about the clones. They went hard after them.
Well, the first clones, yeah, they went after those hard, and they were all out of business. And then Apple made this decision: we're going to go into the clone business too. Going to make more money off our operating system, get our stuff in more people's faces. And the problem was some of those clones were made by companies who were so good at the hardware that their computers were better than the actual Macintoshes.
I didn't hear
so
that.
when the new operating system came out, Apple didn't share it and put all their clone manufacturers out of business.
Yeah, they definitely didn't play fair with their clones. IBM didn't have a choice because they didn't own the operating system. So they couldn't do it. Exactly. And then he just got the windfall. I don't even know what the Adobe people were thinking. Not Adobe, I mean Xerox. When they gave them the GUI operating system, that was just it. Curtains.
Well, that was the thing. It was stolen. It wasn't so much given. There was a court case later on, and I think Xerox got an out-of-court settlement about it. I don't even know if it went that far, though. But it was basically this thing where they went, and this Xerox guy was doing a demonstration, and they were checking out the demonstration. And then Steve Jobs says to Steve Wozniak, "Do you think you could build that?" And Steve Wozniak is, "Yeah."
Well, I heard they had gotten some of the source code to start them
I heard
off.
that they got some of the source code somewhere.
So maybe they paid off a janitor or something to steal something. I don't know.
I know it was more stolen than acquired. It was the sort of thing where Xerox could have ended up being bigger than Microsoft. And
Xerox would have owned. They had it in '79. They had it a full 5 years before everybody else did.
Yeah,
they would have dominated the market. But the guys sitting up in Rochester were too busy creating the 401k plan to steal money from their employees. And so they didn't have to pay their taxes on it.
Yeah, don't get me started on Xerox. So I used to work for Xerox.
Really? I didn't know that.
Not directly. I worked for one of their contractors in Xerox was the contractor. So I did I did work directly for Xerox. Xerox was the contractor, and we were working for Apple. So I did tech support for people who were calling up about their phones.
Oh, really?
But yeah, it's contracted out. That's Xerox's big business now. Xerox's big business was business services. And then the business services end of the company got so big that it spun off of Xerox as a new company called Conduit, which is actually making more money than Xerox, but you don't know who they are because they're just providing business services for companies you do.
Well, that's another big shtick that they've been doing lately. In the slashing in in the old slash your corporation in half, stick all the debt over in the old firm that's dying, and let it sink, and then you never have to pay.
But while I was working for them, and to be fair, it was because of the previous owners that they bought the business from. So it was inherited bad behavior. It wasn't their bad behavior. But there was literally, for the first 3 of the 6 years I worked for Xerox, there was at least one new class action suit every year where almost everybody in the building got at least a little bit of money if they worked in the building during X time and X time, because the company before Xerox kept getting nailed for wage theft.
Yeah.
And Xerox was still having to settle the class action suits after
they bought the
company. And so they're still doing all these class action suits. And because some of the management was the same, the management was still stealing wages on the site, I mean. And when they found out about that, they got rid of them, but the damage was done. So Xerox actually put through in their employment agreement, you have to go through our mediation process. You can't sue us if you want to work for us.
Oh, that's a classic. Everyone does that now.
Everyone does that now, yes. But Xerox is the one that they specifically did it because of 3 years in a row of class action payouts.
When I was in college, I worked at UPS, and I had to sign a contract like that, and I had a union, and we still had to go through so-called business arbitration through the union rep and that. I mean, it worked out for me once.
At least you're not a home care worker in New York City where there's an industry and it's an industry union, so it includes both worker representatives and the industry representatives. An industry union board handles all the regulations for the home care industry in New York, and you're letting them regulate themselves.
Now that's an interesting topic. Why wasn't that on the MAGA communism thing? Where's the union regulations and union
development? Let me look at this. In fact,
there's nothing that I remember. No labor laws.
There's nothing really labor here, actually.
No. This thing.
Well, you call it communism, but there's nothing actually terribly communist in the Marxist sense.
The businesses he wants to grow, we don't know whether they're worker co-ops or capitalist, single owner propriety. Well,
my assumption is they're proprietorships.
I would agree with that.
The people who support him and are defending him were specifically citing a program to increase small business ownership in China under the circumstances I mentioned before, because they want restaurants and bookstores and things like that to be owned by business in China and not an American corporation. It's smart. It's smart economic nationalism from them.
Well, when you got 1.4 billion, you got to figure out how to do it, and you got to keep the money pretty much inside the system. Otherwise, you start getting wage slaves like we have down at the border.
And that's the whole thing is that they have been able to avoid the fate of North Korea and Cuba by making certain accommodations to the global capitalist system.
Well, I would say that Cuba would be my first pick for the most communist country.
They accepted our offer. The house is ours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's kind of a big deal. We'll see what happens next.
Oh, well. If not,
But yeah.
And look, why wouldn't they pick Cuba instead of China? I mean, Cuba's done a far greater.
So here's the problem with Cuba instead of China.
Well, Florida.
Yeah.
It's got a name.
Yeah. And beyond that, either it's like you're trying to rebrand yourself to attract people to the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to rebrand yourself to attract people to the Republican Party, sure, it's kind of a hard sell to talk about MAGA communism when the actual MAGA people are anti-China.
I know.
But
they've been far more happy about Cuba lately for some odd reason.
These MAGA communist people seem to think that this China is the country that Republicans are most like, which doesn't seem to match up very well.
Well, I think there's some certain things that do.
They have this idea in the same nationalist sense that Trump communicated it. This economic nationalist idea of bringing the industry home.
Oh, yeah.
Now, of course, if you really brought the industry home, you're destroying that global supply chain. People all over the world are losing their jobs. It's one thing when you say, well, they never should have signed NAFTA because NAFTA impoverished people in the U.S.
Didn't help too many people in Mexico either.
Didn't help too many people in Mexico either. That's a big part of the problem. But beyond that is that
the only people that really made out in NAFTA were the Canadians. I mean,
and the people in Mexico who own manufacturing companies that contract with American corporations.
True, but I would still say the Canadians got out a far bit better. I mean,
definitely.
I mean, the car manufacturers moved up to Toronto from Detroit.
Well, some of them moved down to Mexico.
Some did, but that's only pretty recently that Dodge has done that.
Well,
Ford will never do that. My brother, who works in the industry, is in Kentucky, right in Elizabethtown, where they make the chassis for the F-150. Ford is desperate to get the prices down on it, but they won't move that because they know basically that they know that their clientele's too racist. If they move it to Mexico, where they want to go with it, they know that they will never buy the truck again.
GM went to Mexico fairly early.
GM did go earlier.
And GM, in what I still think is like one of the true classic shoot yourself in the foot marketing gimmicks, GM came out with their line Saturn, which was a union busting line. They specifically built that factory in North Carolina to bust a union in Michigan. But all that aside, and getting around unions and a whole bunch of other things, that factory in North Carolina, they made a big deal about the employees owning the company, which was always exaggerated, but whatever.
It was more like Pan Am at the end than actually ownership.
Yeah.
They had stock options.
Yeah. But they made all this big deal about how the employees owned the company and everything was made in the U.S. and nothing was imported. And, and Saturn was a good car. It was made in the USA. I mean, all this. And then just a few years in, they're like, yeah, we're gonna move all the Saturn manufacturing to Mexico.
Yeah,
like the worst public relations move you could have possibly made.
Well, I think the worst public relations move they ever made was the original EV1.
Remind me about that.
They were decades ahead of everybody else.
Yes.
And then what killed them? California's fossil fuel board, emissions board.
Yeah,
that's what killed them. I mean, that and the fact that I think they were scared what they were going to do with the car. I mean, they had spent so much money on putting
the catalytic converter. Well, your car doesn't have a catalytic converter. It doesn't run on gasoline. It still doesn't have a catalytic converter.
Well, what do I need one for my electricity? I didn't know there was one. That's an inverter. Do we have a catalytic inverter? Will that work for you? They spent a lot of money, GM, on those projects.
Now, look at all the money that Exxon puts into alternative fuels that they're never going to bring to market just so they can keep selling oil.
That's true.
I mean, I love that. I mean, I can't decide. They don't run the commercial anymore. They used to run on MSNBC all the time. The nice lady in the lab coat with the red hair who talks about how she's farming for energy. And
I know the one you're talking about.
Algae experiment.
with the big whiteboard, and then it
And I
turns
just
into like a.
thought to myself that she is either one of the most well-meaning complete dupes in history, who believes everything she says and is being horribly taken advantage of by Exxon, or she's the worst liar ever.
I was going with actress.
That's always possible too.
That she never existed really at all. That she was just some actress.
It's always possible. That's always possible.
But you never saw it in another commercial, so maybe I don't know. What else was another good one though? But they're advertising those kind of things all over.
Oh yeah.
Like AP and Reuters now picks them up, and you see them on Twitter every 2 seconds. Like, this company just cares about, making trucks for disabled veterans that have no legs. It's like, yeah.
If that's the case, if you really care about making trucks for disabled veterans with no legs, what's this here that says you'll put $1 towards a truck for a disabled veteran for every $1,000 I spend on a truck?
That scam, yeah. We'll match at $1 a ton. Yeah, that's the credit card guy.
Yeah,
it was like at every purchase is $5 goes to up to $1 million.
Yes,
at $5 at a time. I'm like, what? It'll take 100 years to get there at that rate.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. Or like the stores now, they don't even pretend that they're donating. It says on the little screen, "Would you like to donate X amount of money to Y charity?" And it's like, but you're getting credit for being socially conscious by asking me to donate money every time I use your machine with my debit card.
That's true, but outside of the door, it always says this store is donated X number of dollars.
Yes, because when you donate, you're giving it to them to donate in their name.
I know.
And the store gets the tax deduction instead of you.
That's true. I like the ones that actually say, "Do you want to add the extra like 3 or 4 cents to the donation so they don't have to pay the 3%?"
Yeah, all sorts of
Would you like to add a tip on that too of this amount? Like, wait a minute, it's a donation plus a tip. What's going on here? And that's the extravagance of it all.
And of course, people don't want to talk about this because they think it's boring. And they don't think that people will want to watch it on TV. And maybe they're right. Who knows? But it's not less exciting than some of the horrible stuff they do bore us with, like the Queen's funeral.
Oh, my God. What was that about?
John McCain's funeral. I mean, when was the last time cable news ran a senator's funeral like that? They only did that to rebuke Trump.
You think that was it? I don't know.
They also had, of course, the alleged liberal media had a huge fetish for John McCain.
I think that was more of it. I think when he did the thumbs down thing, that just absolutely won him the hearts of all the liberal media people who had already thought he was he's finally proven us right. He's actually voted against a Republican president. Because despite the whole maverick reputation, he almost never did that. Oh, yeah. The only thing he did that was a maverick was get caught in the Keating 5 scandal.
There were a couple of other maverick things, but the maverick things that he did were all tremendously popular. Because part of the maverick reputation was McCain-Feingold, and McCain-Feingold was tremendously popular.
But never got passed.
It got passed. It got repealed by the Citizens United case. It was the law of the land. That's why you hear them talking about we can't take soft money in an episode of The West Wing.
Oh, that's right.
I know people love to hate on The West Wing, but one of the things that you can tell from watching The West Wing is how certain things have changed.
I've never actually watched The West Wing that carefully.
So one of the most, because early on in The West Wing, like early season, they have the episode about that. But nowadays, I mean, it doesn't work that way.
I'll tell you this: that whole entire show just kind of reminds me of an idealized Clinton administration.
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing you have to remember is that Aaron Sorkin was a media assistant
I know.
on Bill Clinton's first campaign.
I know.
And the best part, is that the author of Primary Colors
Mm-hmm.
is just so absolutely brutal to Arlen Sporkin, who is,
I know.
he's the only guy, he's the only character in the whole book who is that obviously someone real. I mean, you can read into some things and say, well, yeah, this character has kind of the James Carville thing going on. But you don't really see that until you see Billy Bob Thornton play the guy in the movie, and he looks like James Carville.
And he acts like James Carver.
James Carville, yes, he does.
Carville. I want to know this, though. Who do you think advised him to continue with the Ricky Ray Rector execution? Was it Carvel or was it Stenopolis?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, you got to think. I mean, how serious versus trying to be funny do you want me to be? I'm usually not very good at being funny, but I'll give you.
I'm being serious. I'm being 100%. I'm being 100% serious because I mean,
serious answer. And I hate to sound like I'm blaming the woman, but my serious answer is Hillary probably told him to go through with that execution.
I don't know. I mean, I've always thought it was Stenopolis told him. He always seems like he's craven enough to say it. Like, Hillary probably backed him, but I think it's Stenopolis because
I just get the feeling. I just see Hillary.
Because it was totally unnecessary. The guy had the IQ of a 12-year-old.
Well, I just see Hillary sitting in a corner saying, Bill, you're a Democrat. That means you got to show them you're tough. And not
that was definitely part of it because he lost that election in '83 because he supposedly showed clemency to someone, and ever since then, I don't know. But I mean, and the sad part about our society is that's aged pretty well for him.
Well, I mean, and that's really the whole terrible thing is that Bill Clinton was horrible for civil rights. He was horrible for the economy. He was horrible for American workers. He was just bad all around. And yet, people remember him as like our last good president or something silly like that. And it just wasn't true.
It just goes to show you the power of basically having a .com bubble.
Well, my mom, and I love my mom. I'm not calling my mom stupid. My mom's actually pretty smart. She was talking about legal weed before most people who went to my church when I was a kid were talking about legal weed. So I got to give my mom credit for some things. But the simple fact is that my mom, for all that smart stuff, she still thought that Jimmy Carter had actually been as liberal as people talked about him being when he wasn't president anymore. And Carter was too good a man to be a good president. It's like, no, he did all the things Reagan did.
Well,
he appointed the Fed chair who did the things we remember Reagan for. That was Carter's guy, not Reagan's guy.
Volcker was his guy. And Volker's shock started in 79, not 80. The shock treatment. And
that's right.
And it was the destruction of the Teamster Union through deregulation that made Reagan win.
And then, of course, Reagan broke the air traffic controllers and made the whole idea of winning a strike a joke.
Yeah, well, made it possible because then what do you have? You have the big Arizona, the Dodge Phelps strike in Arizona in '83 to '86. That thing took 3 years, and that broke the steel workers.
Mm-hmm.
It's another interesting thing. We don't see anything about that, about repealing the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947.
That is not on this list. It would be on my list.
That would be on my list, but you can't even. I had a conversation recently with what's his name, Harvey J.K., who
Yeah.
I'm not totally won over with him.
I like Harvey on a personal level. He's a nice guy. He's a witty raconteur. His personal ideas are good. If you say something socialist, he's probably going to agree with you. But at the same time, his actual political instincts are very social democratic.
I don't know. It's his love of FDR that just makes me kind of cringe.
Well, that's the whole thing, though, is that Bernie loves FDR the same way.
I don't. Do you think so? I'm not really sure. Maybe you've spoken to him. I haven't, but I have spoken to
Bernie's whole democratic socialism, which I put in air quotes, of course, but Bernie's whole democratic socialism shtick is the New Deal. If FDR had been able to do all the things he wanted to do, it's not some decisive break with capitalism.
Oh no, it's not. You can definitely tell that.
It's not even what Norman Thomas would have done instead of FDR if Norman Thomas were president.
And it's nowhere near what was going to happen in Sweden in '72.
Yeah, well, CIA will always shoot a prime minister somewhere.
It breaks up the monotony.
Actually, to be technical, it was more likely a conspiracy within their own security services. But the guy who did it was probably friends with the guy in the CIA.
Oh, they definitely knew it was going to happen, and they definitely made sure that it did happen.
Oh, yeah.
They probably send him money. It's a little gift to get the job done right.
Well, I mean, it's just one of those things where you don't want to see anything ruin anything. We had the coup in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
There was even a certain amount of attempts. LBJ, can we do anything about Harold Wilson? Because LBJ and his CIA buddies and Harold Wilson's own national security establishment all thought Harold Wilson was a communist. And they thought Harold Wilson's director of MI6 was a communist spy.
We definitely made sure that we reshuffled the decks in every country we came to.
But we couldn't get rid of Wilson. Wilson was more popular than ever for opposing Vietnam. Everybody was like, "Don't send any more troops to an American war." And
but you could discredit him.
Yeah,
after a while.
Yes.
And if you can't kill him, you discredit him, which is almost as good. Not as satisfying, perhaps, to some.
Well, and that's the trouble, is that was the era where, even though Wilson was better than some, it wasn't too long after Wilson that, of course, British labor started discrediting itself in the worst way.
Well, that's the 70s. I mean,
the awful Callahan administration.
Well, I mean, that and the fact that basically, let's face it, they did a lot of things to discredit labor. The government, they shut half the cities down to like 3 days in office, but they didn't pay them for 5, so everyone was upset at labor.
Yeah,
demanding too much. They turned off all the heat everywhere, so everything was cold. I mean, you're seeing it in Germany right now. Germany, I don't know what the German plan is, but whatever it is, it's not going to end well.
No. And it's just, the German plan is to sacrifice their own economic self-interest for the glory of the NATO fatherland.
I mean, this is one
now,
sword, not.
Let's not forget. I mean, how many Nazis were hired when NATO was formed?
I really don't know a count, but it's.
I mean, so in their own way, in its own way, NATO is sort of kind of a German kid, and of course they want NATO to succeed, and they're willing to sacrifice for their child.
In some way, it's kind of a reenactment of the last days of World War II right now.
Yes,
kind of. The Germans are finally getting to see if they could support Berlin and not have it invaded by the hordes of Russians. But I mean, we all bought half the German Navy was former SS and not, Kriegsmarine after the war. And Donitz got what, 10 years? And then he took over the Navy.
Well, I mean, but that's the whole thing, is the reason that Donitz got 10 years, and obviously you can say that it doesn't matter, and you're right in a way, because he went along with it. He was running the Navy for the Germans and knew what was going on. But with Donitz, they could say he's never been a Nazi.
I know.
Because he was never a member of the Nazi Party.
I know.
But at the same time, at the point in his career when he became the last Fuhrer of the Third Reich,
he knew everything then.
Yeah. I mean, once you become Fuhrer, you're a Nazi. I don't care if you never joined the party. You knew everything at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only thing that really saved him was that he surrendered so quickly.
Well, he was put in power to surrender. I mean...
Well, he didn't have to. I mean, there were plenty of German officers that didn't. I mean, there was like a 2-year partisan movement.
Donitz was put in power by the general staff, essentially, to ensure a speedy surrender because they just wanted the war to be over.
I know the general staff did, but I'm just talking about there was plenty of rank and file who
did. I know. But that was the whole thing is it could have been so much worse, and they deliberately chose someone who was going to try to wind that down as soon as possible. And you got to figure the fact that he was basically made Fuhrer to surrender, and also that he was convicted of war crimes of which the United States was equal guilty in the war in the Pacific. Oh, yeah. And that Donitz was only convicted of war crimes because he lost. Oh. Because the United States never charged any of the unlimited submarine warfare participants on the U.S. side.
Winners never get charged with war crimes.
I mean,
that's what Curtis LeMay said. So cool.
We were sinking Japanese hospital ships during World War II.
That's because we ran out of targets.
Well,
I mean, that was literally it. They sunk everything because they ran out of targets.
No. I mean, no, they were sinking hospital ships early on. It was one of the factors in Japan's manpower depletion, is that because of unrestricted submarine warfare, U-boats were sinking hospital ships, and people who had already been written off as wounded and eventually were going to come back never came back because the hospital ship got sunk.
Well, we did a lot of things there.
But I mean,
hospitals.
Germany and Japan never deliberately attacked hospital ships. And yet, I mean, I'm not saying Donitz was a great guy. He wasn't. He did all the things he was convicted for. But those are the crimes that only the losers ever get convicted of.
Sure. I mean, you can't justify the bombing of Tokyo in May 6th of 1945, where we burnt 70% of the city to the ground.
The terror bombings of of cities in France and Germany, where the majority of the people who bombs were being dropped on were actually probably friendly to the Allies.
Well, I mean, those are all war crimes. Curtis LeMay said it, but he wanted to do it because he wanted to prove that his B-29, after spending $2 billion on it, was going to work.
That whole Doolittle raid was just... Well, that whole thing was a PR stunt. It didn't have any military significance. It just killed some civilians. But it made everybody feel better.
Well, yeah. Well, you can understand that. You do need a PR when you just get attacked. You do need to feel like you strike back. So I understand it from a military standpoint, but from a legal war standpoint, you're probably not in a good place.
It's probably not the best way to do it. No, they probably could have picked a better target.
I mean, but you got all that. I mean, and what we did in Iraq. I mean, there's no reason to saturate bomb places in Iraq. They have no air force.
I mean,
Never
the whole idea in the first Gulf War was if we just bomb the whole country, we won't have to invade. They'll surrender without a fight. And it didn't work. We still had to invade at the end for them to actually do what we wanted them to do.
I think that again, we can break that down to Schwarzkopf not wanting to be left out of the party.
Maybe.
I think they pushed.
Because remember, that was the strategy in Vietnam, too. We were going to bomb them into surrender.
Yeah, but Schwarzkopf knew that was never going to work. You always have to take ground.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, heck. I mean, we're talking about World War II. Bombing the British into surrender did not work for the Germans.
No, it didn't.
And I mean...
Didn't work in North Korea?
It did not work. And we blew up so much more of North Korea than the Germans blew up of Britain.
No, that was definitely war crimes.
Half the population... 90% of the city construction, something like that. 90% of urban buildings,
and that including hospitals, schools.
There's the U.S. again, though. Still, well, you got to wonder. No, I guess Obama, even if you go through secrets, Obama is still the only Nobel Peace Prize winner to bomb another Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Who was the other one he bombed?
He bombed Doctors Without Borders, who won a Nobel Peace Prize.
I was going to say
for doctoring all over the world.
Okay, I didn't. I was thinking a nation, another leader, not
Doctors Without Borders. He bombed Doctors Without Borders, and they had won a Nobel Peace Prize.
That was the stupidest thing that committee ever did.
No, well, I mean, that's what there's the wedding. But of course, that was a drone attack, so that was just
no. I meant the Nobel Peace Prize to give it to him to give him the first week,
just because we feel good that he's not W.
That's right. That was, you're supposed to actually show something for this award, otherwise it has no meaning, and they proved that basically.
So the Nobel Peace Prize has always been political.
Oh yeah.
The first American Nobel Peace Prize winner was Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for a peace treaty between Japan and Russia. That basically declared, yes, Japan won, but deprived them of all their primary goals for fighting the war.
Yeah.
Which was basically white supremacy. I mean, we use that word lightly, but we're preserving the imperial balance of power by helping our white friends instead of these other people.
They did get some things, but I guess the Japanese felt they couldn't really hold it.
Well, that's the whole thing, though, is that the Japanese probably couldn't have held it without.
They got Korea.
Which
was one of their big.
Korea.
And they held Korea, so that was their biggest thing.
And they got Formosa.
Well, they got Formosa in the second Sino-Chinese War of 1895.
That's true.
But they got to hold it still. They maintained it. They didn't have to return it. And
Exactly.
The Chinese were forced to actually admit that it was going to always be a Japanese land, basically.
And the only reason that it ended up otherwise is because the U.S. made it a military base. And when Chiang Kai-shek had to go running for his life, there was conveniently a U.S. military base for him to hide on. And we said, oh, what the heck? He's Chinese. We'll give him the military base and we'll call it China.
Well, I have to say now we've acted like it's a nation state for so long. It is.
But what's so funny about that is in the 1970s, we said, no, it's not a nation state. It's part of China. And we can't even commit to that.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. Whether or not we declare it or not, everyone in the world acts like it is.
So except the Taiwanese. And in fact, there is a there is a group in Taiwan, the Blue Coalition, which sadly has not won as many elections, but there is a group in Taiwan that is very much against the word Taiwanese because they feel it's tremendously racist. They're not the native people to the island. And more importantly, they're Chinese. They want reunification with China. They just want the government of Taiwan and not in fact, the Blue Coalition is the funniest thing. The Blue Coalition in Taiwan is between the communists who want to eventually rejoin China as part of communist China, and the Kuomintang who want to eventually become the rightful government of China.
Want to be the only China.
Yeah.
It's an inherently problematic situation. But what I was getting at is that, but for most purposes, every country does trade deals with them. They negotiate their own trade deals. Yes. They negotiate their own boundaries.
Yes.
I mean, if we're going to go by the Western standard of Westphalia, right? The Peace of Westphalia, they basically got it. They got everything we need, except that it's just not inconvenient for us to say it out loud.
Also, except for the fact that, they don't have the capacity to maintain.
All right, that's a good clause, but does that really matter? I mean, a lot of nations don't have that.
So here's what it comes down to, in my opinion, and this is, to be fair, I hold our country to the same standard, and I don't care if I take heat for it, but they should go back to China and let the actual Taiwanese have their island back. Now, that's in a perfect world. But
that's 5 generations of people intermixing. That's
well, even beyond that, there are several specific groups of people on Taiwan who are Chinese, but who represent themselves as native Taiwanese when they're not.
I know. I mean, at this point, it's a real mess. But China's going to take it one of these days.
Well, I mean, and it's inevitable at this point. And instead of, and of course you can't do this because competition, superpower conflict, blah, blah, blah. But we should actually be trying to cooperate to find out what would be best for everyone.
No, you can't do that in a zero-sum game like this.
Well, but that's the whole thing. They declare that everything is supposed to be a zero-sum game, but then they decide that this group of people will always win and everyone else will always lose.
That's true. But I think with Taiwan, the only thing you can do is, and I think we're seeing it already, is the fact that we're starting to ramp up all the products that we used to get from Taiwan. You just saw Ro Khanna tweet today. Mm-hmm. What was it? Face masks, semiconductors, steel, glass.
But at the same time, why Nancy Pelosi and several other Congress people went over.
Oh, they went over there to ensure that we weren't going to reduce those. Yeah. But I think what's happening is that we're trying to get both sides, and we figure that when China gets too big, we're not going to defend it.
Well,
because
this is where you get conflict between the professional military people who don't seem to be thinking rationally, or maybe are thinking too hyper rationally and should be a little more emotional and fearful, or the political people. And you've got where you have this whole idea that we should be fighting China in the South China Sea, that we should be trying to take those man-made islands because those are in international waters and they're breaking the law.
Yeah, well, that's all fine and dandy until someone drops a 20 kiloton nuke down.
And really, that's the problem. But there are also people in the military who saw that India and Pakistan fought each other for, what was it, a year and a half, despite both being nuclear powers and nobody lobbing any nukes. And now they're thinking, we can show restraint.
A little different when basically you're sitting right on top of your neighbor.
Yeah.
We got a 3,000-mile distance. Someone's going to say, I think we can risk it.
Yeah.
The fallout won't be so bad over here. It reminds me of, Dr. Strangelove.
They need to read The Beach. There's wind.
Well, we know it. I mean, there's enough radioactivity in like where you live in Oregon, probably from Fukushima.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, there was this whole thing where Pacific shellfish on the West Coast were
slightly radioactive now.
Damaged for the production was damaged for a year. They were saying, don't eat Pacific lobster, don't eat Pacific Ocean crab, don't eat salmon.
I wonder what happened to it. Do you think they really said don't eat it, or did they ship that to some other port, put that in a can and shipped it down to Mexico?
I mean, honestly, if you look at how they handled Flint and how they're handling Jackson, and you've got to think to yourself, it's all still radioactive.
That's what I think. That's a good question, Jackson. Why hasn't Biden been called to the mat for that one?
Well, because it's a red state.
Yeah, but he's the guy that's supposed to be, friends of people of color. Remember, he was going to get rid of those racist tendencies. And that's an 88% people of color city.
So here's the thing. When Democrats say that they need to carry the South, what they're saying is we need to figure out how we can be just racist enough to get more white people without losing any of the black people we've already got.
Yeah, I know that theory.
I don't think it's a theory. So I know people who have run for Congress. In 2020, I was very active helping primary challengers with their Twitter comms.
Uh-huh.
I've been less active since then because I'm very burnt out on electoral politics, but that's a whole nother thing. I don't think it's a useful use of my time anymore.
It's a little bit depressing.
But I've worked with primary challengers. I know how certain things happen on a sense of somebody who's been in the room says to me, well, we had this conversation and this is how it went. And so my general feeling is that it's all very predetermined. There are people, if they think that you're going to buck the system in some way, you're the enemy.
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, they have the political machines haven't left politics. I mean, we have this nice fantasy that you have more choice in a primary than you do, really.
Yeah.
It's a very curated and I mean like the managed.
If the delegates in the 1964 presidential election in the Republican Party had been decided by who won the most delegates in primaries, then Nelson Rockefeller would have been the nominee because he won the New York primary, and that had the most delegates of any of the primaries that all of the candidates chose to participate in. Because remember, this was an era where people didn't run in all the primaries.
No, you didn't. I mean, even Carter didn't run in all the primaries. He ran in 30% of the states or something ridiculously small like that.
Carter was Carter was the first
to run in Iowa.
Carter was the first presidential candidate, the first presidential nominee in the post-superdelegate era. The last presidential nominee in the pre-superdelegate era was McGovern, who was sabotaged by his own future running mate.
I don't understand what
the night before the last night of the convention. After that, number one, I don't understand why he makes Eagleton his running mate in the first place. And number two, I don't understand why he puts his own credibility on the line for him, saying, I'm not going to drop Eagleton from the ticket.
No one can explain what Govern was thinking in 68. I mean, 72. No one can. It's beyond.
But yeah, no, Nelson Rockefeller would have been the presidential nominee if you went by the most delegates.
And he probably would have won too. He was popular.
Oh, well, and you already have the Civil Rights Act, and you have a president who might actually be a little less racist than Lyndon Johnson.
I don't know if Johnson was racist.
So this is where it's tremendously,
or if he was just mostly opportunistic.
I find these things interesting. Johnson, on a purely personal level, between me and you, to your face, was an absolutely horrible racist who was slur this, slur that about anybody who wasn't in the room with him.
I didn't know that about him. I knew he taught
Johnson
Mexican kids.
The Johnson tapes, which are less famous than the Nixon tapes, but which were released to the public in their entirety sooner, and there is, and of what was released, there aren't any weird gaps. Johnson says horrible things about Jews, black people, people from the West Coast, people from the North, people from the counties of Texas he doesn't like, people from southern states that aren't Texas.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I don't think there was anybody Lyndon Johnson wouldn't slur.
He hated the Kennedys.
Yes, he did.
He had an absolute feud with Robert.
Well, and that was the whole thing. He knew that Bobby was JFK's number one guy, and he wasn't. And sideline vice presidents who don't get to spend much time with the president don't like whoever actually spends the most time with the president. And the fact that it was the president's kid brother cannot have helped.
Oh, no, it didn't. He made some strong comments about nepotism in the White House that he felt was unhealthy.
Yes, yes.
And he also felt it was unhealthy that Teddy was also moving up in the ranks too. And he felt I guess he thought he was going to be replaced by one of them.
Well, I mean, there was a strong question about whether LBJ would be replaced on the ticket in 64. That was only resolved by Kennedy getting shot. Not that I'm in any way suggesting a conspiracy.
It was just very convenient.
But very convenient, especially since Kennedy had gone out of his way not to start a shooting war in Laos, and LBJ almost immediately started trying to figure out how to start a shooting war in Vietnam.
Well, you got to stop those Laotians supporting the Viet Cong. Best way to do it is to drop about 100,000 or so mines every week.
Well, I'm not even getting onto that. I mean, I'm even beyond the mines is the Kennedy went out of his way to avoid a shooting war. I know. I'm just saying that LBJ went straight for we can start with mines and then we'll work to incursion. They attacked one of our ships while it was peacefully laying mines off the coast.
That's right.
Now let's pretend that the Vietnamese really had the naval capacity to attack the ships alleged in the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Well, I mean, there were 2 light destroyers against 2 gunboats.
And it's kind of an uneven.
They should never have gotten within the defensive screens.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where, if it had been a legitimate attack, your excuse is they attacked our peaceful ships while they were laying mines in international waters, which is a war crime.
Well, I mean, but on the same case, we never prosecuted the Israelis for attacking our ship, the USS Liberty, almost.
Well, to go on to the things we've never prosecuted people for, and the things we have becomes really uneven really fast, doesn't it?
And, I mean, that was a big deal. I mean, and that was because we were interfering with the 6-Day War.
I mean, we've never prosecuted a former president. Even Nixon got pardoned.
Preemptively pardoned.
Harding had the good sense to die in office before he had to worry about facing charges after.
But I mean, you got to really wonder how you get a preemptive pardon.
You know you're guilty, and you convince the vice president. Well, no, one, you know you're guilty, and two, you have the power to appoint your successor.
Well, that's true, but I mean. As bad as everything. I mean, we got to just say that Trump was just an absolute idiot. I mean, he should have pardoned himself, or he should have
There was a whole lot of discussion about the self-pardon thing.
I know, but let's say that he couldn't do that. He should have just quit the day before. Said, "Pence, pardon me, pardon yourself. I'll leave a pardon in the desk for you. You leave a pardon in the desk for me, and this will be fine." Make it very broad, like anything I've ever done in my whole life. That's a federal crime.
See, but the whole thing was what I think not pardoning himself was, and they talked about this, is if you pardon yourself, they're just going to go after you on the state stuff anyway. But, and here's the big but. Let's talk about what I said before about the reason that people don't like Donald Trump is because he's the guy who talks about what happens in the room where the only people there are the rich people. Now, I'm not saying that means you can trust him or that he's on our side.
No.
But he talks out of turn because he likes to brag.
Yes, and he likes to make sure that he has power over you.
Yes, and he likes to make sure, and even if he doesn't have power over you, he wants to impress you with how powerful he is so that you will like him because he's so powerful, which is silly because it's like, this person just wants to bully me into liking him. And, that just makes me dislike him more.
Well, that's true. But there's a weird group of people that follow that. Like, oh, wow, I want to be next to that because the hanger-ons. And he had a lot of them. But, I mean, I just thought from a save yourself a lot of time and effort problem.
Well, of course, Nixon had the great advantage of knowing that he was in trouble when his vice president was certain to be convicted of a federal crime.
True.
Which put him in a position of being the only president before or since to essentially pick the next president.
He did.
And, I do not think Trump could have pulled that off the same way Nixon did because he didn't have the degree of power necessary to ensure that only someone who would do that for him got the job.
True. I don't think his relationship with Pence was as good as it needed to be for that.
Well, I mean, and the whole thing. Well, I mean, Nixon and Ford weren't buddies or anything like that. No, Nixon was a lot closer to the side of the party that backed Reagan to run against Ford than he was to Ford.
Well, I know he was, but there was more solidarity there.
Well, there was the fact that they had the solidarity of Ford having been vaguely co-conspiratorized around the edges of Watergate, specifically in the fact that Gerald Ford tried to use his position as Senate Minority Leader to get a U.S. attorney in Maryland to call his people off of Spiro Agnew.
Mm-hmm.
H.W. Bush, Poppy, who was the RNC.
CIA.
That's exaggerated. He was only CIA director for a short amount of time.
I know.
He was a Republican scumbag for his whole career.
But that CIA gave him a lot of good gave him a lot of good connections with people.
He was the RNC chairman during Watergate, and he visited the same U.S. attorney in Maryland to try to, the same U.S. attorney in Maryland to try to get stuff called off.
They were, but you do need a level of corruption. But I think the problem was that he just didn't have it with Pence.
Well, and that's the whole thing. He did not have the corrupt relationships.
And he also iced Pence out, just like LBJ was iced out. So there was no way Pence was ever going to give him anything.
Well, and that was really the biggest advantage that Nixon had, is Nixon was in a position to name somebody as a vice president who he would not have spent, 3 years mistreating like most presidents do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a good gig for Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford couldn't allow the Republican Party to have all those bloody noses all at once. They would never have recovered.
He had to do the pardon.
He had to do it. And he had to fall on his sword, even though he knew that once he did the pardon, he was never going to get elected again.
Yeah, and that's really what it came down to.
I mean, he was always going to be the guy that just stepped in there and cleaned up the mess. It was worse than the know-nothings.
I think that's why he fell down. He wanted to make sure he had that one moment where people would remember him for him.
Falling down in Yugoslavia.
That was genuinely him and not just a placeholder thing.
On your way to meet Ceausescu, you fall 3. No, wow, that was a hell of a tumble. I felt sorry for him. That had to hurt.
Well, I felt sorry for him because Chevy Chase got so many different comedy routines off that one fall. I mean, I know people who believe that some of the Chevy Chase comedy routines, but less absurd, were things that they actually saw happen before. No, just that one fall.
Just that one fall happened.
But it was played over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
And then Chevy Chase blew it up. He fell everywhere, over the desks, over everything. Yeah. But that was a hell of a fall. I mean, he like half the staircase. Boom.
And hey, that was when Chevy Chase was number one, still funny, and number two, wasn't hated by everyone in Hollywood yet.
But he was hated by all his cast members.
That's true. Well,
Chevy never left.
I mean, Chevy Chase is like that one. Chevy Chase's problem, his both strength and his weakness is he hates all the other celebrities. They all hate him too. And it's not because he has some good thing going that makes him somehow better. No, he just hates everybody.
A healthy dose of misanthropic behavior doesn't hurt anyone, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, what I get from Chevy Chase's coworkers is maybe he takes it too far.
You think? That major fight he had with Bill Murray on the Comeback show that turned out to legend. Although I still like the Frank Zappa story best, where he just didn't learn any of the lines and wouldn't say them and wouldn't do anything. But you have to know that's what you're going to get if you get Frank Zappa on your show in 1976. He's just not doing anything.
It's true. But, it's just... It could be worse. It could have been Nixon on Laugh-In. Sock it to me.
All I have to say is this, though. His checkers speech is brilliant. Nixon. I didn't know that dog was a gift. I should have known, but I didn't.
Hey, the way he made it all about the dog and not about the hidden slush money fund, it's like you said, that is seriously brilliant, because it's like that little Cocker Spaniel dog. We're not worried about the dog, Dick. We're worried about the $100 million slush fund from all the corporations in America.
That's right. I mean, that's why I think that what Herschel Walker's doing is so brilliant. He's playing himself up as this idiot, right? So it's like he's bulletproofing himself before he even gets out there. Well, he's just not good.
So number one, and I don't mean this in a funny or lighthearted way, Herschel Walker is a professional football player who played a few years longer than he should have.
Oh yeah, he's got some brain problems.
He's not faking all of it. He's certainly playing it up. I agree with. He's deliberately playing it up.
I would too.
He wants everybody to he wants everybody to remember this as Punchy passed at Herschel and not as prime Herschel, just not ever really being an A-level running back.
That's right. But I mean, it's a brilliant tactic. I mean, it gets you. Nobody likes to see somebody get picked on.
It's
so
true.
you go into a debate and you're like, I mean, it's what's going to make Oz lose to Fetterman, even though sometimes he can't put a sentence together in his interviews.
Especially, yeah, because and it makes me so mad. The same Democrats. I don't want to get. I try not to get too into Bernie because I mean politicians are politicians, Bernie included. But the same Democrats he had a heart attack. We can't rely on him being healthy.
I know.
Are denying that are basically pretending Fetterman isn't a vegetable.
I don't know if he's a vegetable. But
I'm exaggerating, but he's been impaired by his stroke.
He's definitely got some impairment. Definitely.
Now, whether that disqualifies him or not is another question. But the way that the Democrats were...
Oh, yeah, it's a double standard for sure.
Oh, yeah, especially when you consider that, I mean, the heart surgery, the heart attack and heart surgery that Bernie had under the circumstances that he had it are both extremely common and extremely unlikely to have long-lasting effects. As opposed, I mean, if Dick Cheney couldn't have afforded 3 artificial hearts, he would be dead by now.
True.
Because
what scares me more about Fetterman and the way they would treat him is the fact that everyone is whitewashing that whole incident with the jogger.
Yeah.
That is essentially the same incident that happened in Alabama and ended with a dead black jogger.
Yeah, well.
I mean,
people will whitewash anything they can for their side.
I don't know what you can say about that. I mean, there's no good way to make him sound like, and again, but even the alternative media is doing that.
Yeah, Fetterman, I mean, let's look at the plan of attack that Dr. Oz has chosen, which is to associate Fetterman with Bernie Sanders.
Stupid.
Well, I mean, regardless of what you think of American politicians, it does seem I'm going to attack my opponent by comparing him to one of the most individually beloved politicians in this sewer of a nation.
It's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. What'd you do, Ray? I thought of the funniest and the best thing in my life.
Baby? I know. Yeah, we should go ahead.
Okay. I get talking a lot. But yeah, I mean, yeah, well, we'll clip it.
Well, I usually don't. I'll probably put the whole thing up, but
but I mean, that's what goes on with him. I mean, he's going after the wrong guy. He should stick him next to Biden every chance he gets, and he should play the race card.
Why do you? I mean, he's playing to the Trump base, which makes sense in a primary. That's how he won the primary. Mm-hmm. But you're not gonna win a statewide race by playing to the Trump base.
But more importantly, most people still aren't that pleased with Biden. It makes no sense not to attack Biden.
Yeah.
Don't attack the guy that everyone's like, even if only the hardcore Trumpers really hate Bernie. Everybody else has a pretty,
a lot of Republicans like Bernie. That's the real problem. I mean, I'm sure that Joe Scarborough would like to pretend he never said this now. But in 2016, Joe Scarborough reminded people, there are people in Vermont with George Bush and Bernie Sanders signs in their front yard this election season. And that's because they trust Bernie to do his best for them whether he calls himself a socialist or not.
That's a guy that's got to leave the news business.
Well, but occasionally he says something really honest like that, and you don't want him to go away.
Well, I don't know. I like the Sachs. I like the Jeffrey Sachs interview the best when he was having a coronary trying to explain away. But it is a big deal. He's like, no, it's not. Nothing in this deal is a good deal. Well, thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much for coming on. Do you have anything you want to promote?
No, you can find me online at Trotsky Baby, and you can find all my stuff.
This is where you normally would plug your Substack so that people go looking for it.
Well, if you find that, it's right there. I plug my Substack on that.
On your Twitter.
But yeah, my Substack is Leon Trotsky's Revolutionary Newsletter.
And it's pretty good. He's got good thoughts. That's why I wanted to have him on the show. And folks, I hope you all have a great night.
I'd like to come back anytime you want.
Definitely.
We'll try to keep it on track.
Folks, you have a great night, and we'll tweet at you.